So thank you all very much again for having me. So today I'm going to be talking about researching vulgarity in Japanese. Specifically, what I'm going to be doing in this study is combining four different research projects that I've done over the last 5 or 6 years that weren't intended to talk to each other, but hopefully I'm going to make them talk to each other in order to shed light on Japanese vulgarity. And the reason that I've been interested in Japanese vulgarity is that it's something that I think is drastically understudied. There's been a lack of study of vulgarity in general in linguistics throughout its history, but that's been changing a lot in terms of European languages, etc. But there's been a lack of study of Asian context, which I don't know for sure the reasons why, but I imagine people just assume, okay, like it's going to be the same universally, and I don't know if that's true. But even within the Asian context, there's been a specific lack of attention to vulgarity in Japanese, and I believe that's kind of unique to the situation as much as I don't like the word unique, because there's been a long history of discourse about Japan not having any vulgarity whatsoever. So, for instance, we can go all the way back to Ian Fleming's James Bond book, You Only Live Twice, and you can see texts like this where there is a person who is obviously not real, but stating that there are no swear words in the Japanese language and the use of bad language does not exist. The text goes on then to talk about how oh, by the way, I'm going to have to use bad language in this presentation, so just forgive me, but it's for academic purposes. Instead of saying here it's a euphemism for the word fuck, the translation would be shimatta, and then, quote, there is nothing worse to say. They go on then to talk about insults, which are kind of misspelled, such as bakayaro for bloody fool, konchikusho, your animal, but they just call them insults. The difference between insult and vulgarity is tricky, but they're saying there's no taboos. There's nothing like that. And then what about sex words? Again, they list two, which are misspelled, but otherwise there's no such things in our language. Now, this is obviously not an academic paper, but we can find this in early academic research as well, such as in the book Anatomy of Swearing, which was published back in 1967, where they assert that American Indians, the Japanese, Malaysians, and Polynesians, most Polynesians, I guess, do not swear whatsoever. There is no evidence that is presented, but that is kind of what is written in this book. And indeed, this kind of assertion can be found throughout more recent papers as well. Now, I've removed the names of the authors of these papers from these slides, not to violate citation laws, but just because I'm going to be critical here and I don't want to call specific people out. But in this paper here, the performative power of language, Japanese and swearing, you can see the assertion that Japanese is known for its paucity of any swear words like fuck or cunt, despite that Japanese does have a pretty much one-to-one translation for cunt. And they state that their research wonders whether, quote, the very fear of the naked verbal truth might be a reason for the absence of swear words in Japanese, as it is difficult for the Japanese to be fully open to the truth if they cannot be liberated from their belief in kotodama. Now, this is like the spirit of words. This is obviously an example of what we call Nihonjinron discourse, or theories of Japaneseness, wherein people have talked about the uniqueness of the Japanese people. This research body, I guess, research in air quotes, pseudoscience has asserted things from Japanese people having unique stomachs to just in different brains. But this is an example which is less biological, but in the idea that the entirety of Japan, again, there's a constant assertion in Nihonjinron that Japan can be represented by basically any one individual. But of course, any individuals that don't match that are not present in their arguments. But there's this belief that Japanese people can't do this. Now, as for why this argument will be made, who really knows? Of course, the idea that your language and your culture has no swear words and no offensiveness and everyone's nice to each other is a nice idea. It's certainly one that I can see people wanting to believe. And of course, we also have to recognize that the people that are in academia have historically come from upper classes, people who are more wealthy, people who might not encounter this language very often or who grew up not, using it. The working class, criminals, etc., do not tend to write academic papers, but this assertion can be found. Indeed, in this paper here, which again is written by academics with a native Japanese background, there's an idea that Hoshino from 1989 points out that Japanese language does not have a large vocabulary of swear words. Again, is that the fact or is that kind of academics' perception? But regardless of that, they say that those which do exist differ from English swear words, that they seldom related to Christianity or sexual connotations, as if this is something of interest. But like, why would it be? Like, why would Japanese have Christian related swearing? It's just as like saying that, oh, English doesn't have swear words because they don't relate to the things that Japanese does. Like, the manifestation should be different. And the idea, again, that swear words sound humorous when directly translated and lose their effective load, that's true, but that's true of English too. Like, terms like, a shithead, if you translate that literally, that's pretty funny in a lot of languages, and it's not going to have its effective load. But it doesn't mean it's not a vulgarity, and it doesn't mean it's not one that is used. Although they do note that Japanese express rudeness by discarding the respectful form and employing male speech patterns, and that is something we are going to see time and time again. But that doesn't mean these aren't like, if that's not vulgarity, then we need to, because they're not swear words, then we need to rethink what we mean when we say swear words. Like, we need to go beyond just kind of words rather than taking what works in like an English context and applying it universally. But this isn't just in academics as well, as you will find Japanese people asserting that the language has no swear words. For instance, in these studies by DeWall, and these are quite good studies, they note that Japanese participants in a kind of multilingual, multi-background participant set often mention this idea. For instance, a person here who's given the pseudonym of Tomomi states that they don't swear, which is fine. And in Japanese, they don't really have swear words. Again, why the person's asserting this, we're not sure, but that kind of perception is coming up in the data. It's coming up from the respondents. Likewise, in another paper by the same academic, you can see a Japanese person stating that there's fear of social disapproval. So she only knows one Japanese swear word, but she won't use it because it makes her feel like a bad person or uncomfortable. And another person, given the name of Ryoko here, says that they don't like the swearing in Japanese, and there's kind of this cultural difference. Again, here, Japan is asserted to have kind of one culture, which is clearly not the case. There is no place where there is just one culture. Everyone acts the exact same. Everyone does the same thing. But you do see this idea that we shouldn't swear. And potentially, of course, one thing that we as academics need to pay attention to whenever we're doing interviews is the possibility that the person is not telling us the truth because they don't want to appear a certain way. Academics tend to have a perception, traditionally at least, that we're like special, that we're fancy, and people often don't want to let us know that they know a whole bunch of dirty, naughty words because those are, quote unquote, low culture, and that's not something that's supposed to be pleasant. Indeed, I found this in my own research. The book I published last year investigates the Japanese death metal scene, and death metal is not a music which is unfamiliar to vulgarity. But I did interview people like a musician who said that he didn't swear because he felt that direct language isn't Japanese. Although he did hedge this by saying that in Japanese punk, they do use a lot of vulgarity, and that's okay because it has a very punk vibe. I also interviewed somebody who said that they felt they were just embarrassed using swear words, and another person who said they didn't do it because they were already 45. They're just too old for that. And indeed, in contrast, though, we had a female death metal musician, extreme metal musician, who did use swearing in their lyrics, including English swearing. And they noted that there was social censure for this, with even one of their drummers, who you'd think would be okay with this because, again, extreme metal is quite open to swearing, telling her that he didn't want to play music in their band because she was using those lyrics, and saying that, aren't you embarrassed because you're a mom using this kind of language? So this idea then that it's not that Japanese doesn't have swearing, it's that a lot of Japanese people, including especially Japanese women, worry about the social censorship of even recognizing that they notice these terms, because even in scenes which embrace it, or at least embrace its use by men, you can have this kind of critique happening. But even in English, right, you can go online. These are all quotes from Twitter that I found just in a quick little search. You can find people who are not Japanese asserting that Japanese doesn't have curse words. 27,000 views on someone saying that Japanese is probably the only language where they don't have real curse words. Again, how do we define real curse words? I don't know, but that's the assertion. Japanese, even though they don't have a definite swear word, Japanese typically don't swear. Does Japanese even have conventional swear words? They have no swear words, right? You have this kind of thing coming over and over and over again. And you even have things like this, where these articles about a time when the American was talking to the Japanese Sega company, and the person told the translator to tell the Japanese guy from Sega to fuck off, and the translator said that there's no expression for this, and the guy from the American version said, I know there is, and I think he's right. But of course, the translator is not, they're not safe. Telling somebody to fuck off, even as a translator, is risky because it's not your words, but they are coming out of your mouth, right? There's an issue there that we see things like this, we shouldn't go, oh, Japanese doesn't have a word for fuck off. Interesting. We should embrace what Moore's saying here, that Japan has thousands and thousands of years of history, which includes lots of civil war and conflict. In that history, there's no question that a few people have wanted to tell a few other people to go away in a very, very rude manner. The fact that a translator doesn't want to say this is not evidence that the words don't exist. It's evidence that a translator maybe doesn't want to tell the head of a major Japanese company to go away in this kind of terminology. So there has been, though, fortunately, some recent research which is investigating this. Japanese has really, in terms of sociolinguistics, been focused on in terms of understanding gendered language and politeness. But books like the ones you're looking at are all in Japanese and are looking at instead the conveyance of rudeness. The one in the middle there is about a polite form, but there's stuff about the use of this sarcastically, etc. And all of these are kind of building on that. And we've had work like Suzuki, who has been looking at impoliteness and hypermasculine language and shock advertising, comparing, for instance, you can see the two posters there. The one using a man that has a lot of forms that could be considered rude or impolite to tell people not to break the law, whereas the one with the woman is, saying like, don't break the rules. And you have things like these games, Monster Strike, that are using forms like shirukayo, which are generally seen as not polite, in a form of shock, right? To get people to pay attention to the advertisement and kind of looking at the makeup of this quote unquote unpleasant, vulgar, however you want to define it, language. So in my presentation today, then, I'm going to be attempting to show my own contributions to this kind of body of research. I'm not going to pretend that I know everything about this. I'm not going to pretend that this research is done, but I do want to show things that I've done that help maybe expand these ideas. And one thing I think that's always important when studying a single language like Japanese is to bring this outside of one given context. It's all, studying Japanese to learn more about Japanese is fine, but we always want to find things that go beyond an individual country or language. So I'll also hopefully highlight what paying attention to Japanese could tell us about vulgarity more as a universal phenomenon, because I think the problem that we haven't been looking at Japanese vulgarity is not just an issue for the study of Japanese, but just an issue for the study of how we do things, especially offensive things, via language around the world. So the four studies I'm combining here, the one on the top left is one that I published quite a long time ago, that had nothing to do with vulgarity initially, but instead I was looking at translations of Joe Biden's comments during the debate with Trump, where he called Trump a clown and said that it's hard to get a word edgewise with him, and told him to, will you please shut up, man, which became like a part of merchandise, etc. And initially this was actually a study on how risk, so in other words, the risk to the translator of translating things in a way that people found offensive or whatever, could be an influence on translation, but it's going to kind of launch us in here. The second study is then a chapter in a book that is coming out hopefully this year or early next year on vulgarity in Asia, which is very exciting, and looking at Japanese responses to Ado's song Usseewa and why they found it objectionable. The third then is a study on the translation of English vulgarity into Japanese, which has passed peer review and should be out this year. And then the fourth is a study on the language use of a Japanese talento, like a talent, a person who goes on the media, etc., named Allen-sama, who has developed kind of their own register of Japanese known as Kurimango. And I'll be discussing how my intent in studying this was actually not to do vulgarity either, but vulgarity has come up as an important issue in this data. So that's more tentative as the paper on this is currently being written. But, we're going from published to in press to new stuff. So hopefully I can link these studies together. That's my goal, to make some kind of common, sensible argument. So let's start with the first one then, which again was back into the 2020 presidential debate where Biden said things like, would you shut up, man, and called Trump a clown, which was national or even international news because these kinds of comments were not expected during a debate performance. So what I did in this study was I looked at how these comments were translated in mainstream news and compared it against how they were translated in Japanese blogs that were covering these. And so, as you can see here, these various forms are all pretty similar, divided between four different news networks, and they're all translating shut up via the verb damaru, damatte, and using a form of the verb kureru in the plain form or kurenai, and then ending with the sentence final ka. This is obviously not something that you normally do. It's not like when we teach plain form Japanese, we usually advise against using ka in questions, right? It's like damatte kureru, rising intonation, because ka can sound kind of accusatory, aggressive, associated with masculine speech. Some of these forms also in the Arab news Japan, you saw oi being used, which may sound like nothing, but oi has been like signified as a potentially aggressive or even offensive Japanese phrasing. Like getting someone's attention via oi is not considered a polite, a good thing to do. But they're all kind of linking in using these various items. However, this was not uniform, as places like HuffPost Japan and TV Tokyo actually translated this into the polite form. So, for instance, onegai dakara chotto damatte kudasaimasen ka is like damaru, using damaru is not great, but kudasaimasen ka is obviously a pretty formal request form. It's beyond kudasai in terms of politeness, and similarly, like shizuka ni shite kuremasen ka, you have the kind of negative request using the negative form then, which don't really show at all why this was international news, why the Biden team, for instance, put this on a T-shirt, things like that. These kind of there seems to be a hiding or a reluctance to use forms like even kureruka in proper news, right? So we are seeing differences in kind of what forms are acceptable. And that said, there was a damatte, so just a te form with nothing at the end, and one example of damatte kure, which uses a more of a command form. Now, all of this diversity, though, does not really hold a candle when we go to the blogs, because except for this, which is using damate again and then kurenai, but instead of ka, it's using kana, almost like Biden is kind of thinking to themselves. I wonder. The blogs are pretty much universal in going beyond any of these forms and using forms that the newspapers refuse to use. For instance, we had chotto wa damare, damare, oi, damare usse, using, we'll talk about usse more when we move to Ado. And then omae wa damattero, right? So we have command forms, we have oi again, we have conjugations like urusai becoming usse, and we have second person pronouns like omae, which are considered potentially offensive, accusatory, etc. And what's interesting is in explaining all this, in trying to analyze all this, my argument was that the issue of risk here made it so that while the newspapers had a risk of if they offended their readership or if somehow they offended like the American president or something, that would cause problems for them. But with the blogs, their risk is actually that no one reads them. And if the blogs are just doing the exact same thing as all the newspapers are, then why do they exist, right? What's their market share? In actually using these forms, and we can see that like the newspapers refuse to use them, but the blogs do use them, which gives us hints that these are forms that are not expected in the register, the context of a newspaper. There is, of course, some risk that they'll offend people, but there's a benefit that they'll get people to come in and read these blogs and believe that the bloggers are giving them the truth. Indeed, what I found kind of hilarious is that one of these blogs claimed that the Japanese translations they were using were not even enough because in American culture, telling someone to shut up was extremely offensive because of the American cultural value of freedom of speech. Uh, I don't know what you call this, like reverse Orientalism, Occidentalism, I guess. But it was this framing of I can tell you things that the mainstream news is not because I know the true insights about American culture. I know why this is so offensive. Whereas, of course, shut up is used all the time in America. And it's not a nice thing to say, but it's not violating our fundamental sense of freedom of speech. That's a bit of an exaggeration. Similar things happened with the phrase, it's hard to get a word in with this clown, excuse me, this person. This was less translated on the whole. For instance, Bloomberg, Gendai Business, and the Wall Street Journal just mentioned that Biden called Trump an orokomono, so a foolish person, an idiot. They didn't explain kind of how. And the Yomiuri translated it as honto ni orokomono da. And so I guess a clown is not just an orokomono, but a honto ni orokomono. I'm not really sure. Wall Street Journal on their main do just translated Piero, so like a literal translation, which I guess works, but of course in Japan, I mean, calling someone a Piero, a clown, I'm sure is not like considered a compliment, but there's not a history of terms like class clown. It doesn't kind of have that. It's not a common insult to the same extent. And TBS Live used it as well, calling it a clown-like situation, right? Piero no yona joukyo. And saying that they can't, get a word in, but also using desne, right? Getting into the semi-polite form there. And similarly, in the TBS after translation, you had when your conversational partner is a clown like this, you can't get a word in. They were the only ones to actually translate the "excuse me, this person," translating it to "kono kata," right? In contrast, though, in the blogs, you did have something like this, "kono Piero ga aite," so that's very, very similar to what we saw earlier. But you had translations of clown as takoyaro, or literal octopus, bastard kind of thing. And then also the use of ze, right, the masculine form, kotoba ga nai ze. Similarly, translating it as not bakamono or orokomono, but baka, just kono baka, right, cutting off these forms. You saw again the blogs using forms that the newspapers refused to use in these translations in order to get that kind of market share, which indicates that, again, these forms are considered somehow worse or somehow less appropriate for mainstream discourse in some way. Let's move on, though, to Usseewa, which was actually a study I did intending to find out about Japanese vulgarity. And this was about Ado's song Usseewa, which is a song that was incredibly popular a long time ago. It still is her most popular song in terms of total views on YouTube, at Spotify, etc. And Ado herself is, of course, still extremely popular, being, I believe, the most listened to Japanese artist overseas last year. And yeah, so this made mainstream discourse. So I wanted to kind of understand why this song was seen as offensive. And to do so, I went onto some Japanese blogs, no, sorry, not blogs, Japanese web forums, and found a large amount of discourse about the song and why it was unpleasant, and kind of used that as my data. So there's a lot we could talk about, like from the top down, because the song has words like kuso, right, which is usually translated as shit, but can be used similar to fucking in English to be a kind of emphasizer. So here we have kuso darina. This is obviously a variant of darui. Darui, again, changing to dari. That kind of anything that kind of violates the standard presentation can be seen as less appropriate language use. Again, we saw use being specifically used earlier by a blog to sound more offensive. So you have that kind of conjugation. Anything where the I sound gets changed to an A. And then you also have, the command form that we saw in the Biden speech as well. Well, here's the exact example, kusei, but next to it you have kuchi fusageya, right? So instead of fusagu, fusage, fusaide kudasai. Very, very different uses of these conjugations to be more aggressive, to be more potentially offensive. But this isn't really interesting to me because it's just us saying like, hey, there's these words that we have established are offensive. Look, there they are. Therefore, it's offensive. That's not really a study or a research paper. So in terms of the comments, then, what was interesting is that out of the 408 comments that I looked at, there's a pretty much even, almost one third, one third, one third explanation where some people said that it was about the content. So people were complaining about the fact that this song the messages are bad for children or it's arrogant. One third then talked about the song causing them negative feelings, saying it was like unpleasant or cringe, using the term itai. And then another third stated that the words themselves are vulgar or bad, using words like gehin or, kotoba zukai ga warui. They had this difference between how people were approaching it. It wasn't simply everyone saying like they use the word kuso, therefore it's bad. So this is, I think, my favorite comment in the data because it literally like breaks down various levels of inappropriateness. They note that like the art and the voice are aggressive, the lyrics are awful, they frowned, but they said that like they wish they used better words, ii kotoba zakai ni shite hoshikatta. And they also note there's the gender issue, saying that a girl is singing it after all. And then they start with like urusai yo would be better, but then like urusai na would be one step down, urusei na would be one step down, but then usewa is like the worst. So we've actually kind of ranked it. And if you're approaching vulgarity from the question of swear words, that doesn't really work here because they're all one word, arguably. Like we'd call these a single lexeme to, use the academic terminology. But we are clearly going more and more offensive, and this person's actually giving us the various steps of that. Interestingly, though, out of the comments, regardless of how we break them down, 195, so 38.61%, Actually, their problem with it was more about who uses the language rather than the specific language forms. So, indicating that the issue of vulgarity was very, very much social. And this, of course, is something that we've always kind of known. Like words like kuso, shit, etc., used to be just like the word for fecal matter. But as societies developed, as people, especially people with means and people who were without means that like tried to distance themselves to language, some of these terms became reimagined as vulgar. But you see here that, for instance, the first person notes that they don't like the song because it reminds them of Chunibyo. This is a term referring to, it literally means something like second year middle school sickness. And initially, it was a term that referred to just kids in middle school acting like kids in middle school, prepubescents being annoying. It got adopted by the internet when these prepubescents started going on places like 2chan because they would jump in during the summer holidays and stuff like that. And so people would complain about how the Chunibyo are entering their web forums. But over time, it's just become evolved into a term to mean anyone who behaves in a embarrassing way, in a way associated with young people rather than mature people. And in all these kind of comments, you can see people stating that the issue with the lyrics isn't specific words, but the kind of people that they associate with these words. And that's a bit of a tautology, right? Like these words are bad. How do we know it? Well, these bad people use these words. How do we know those people are bad? Well, they use the bad words. But that tautology is not unique to Japan. It's not unique to this context. But it's interesting to me that the people, the users of these language forms are primary. And while Chunibyo is the number one group that was mentioned, throughout the data, there were tons of different groups. Like you have the first person here, these are all translated, by the way. Obviously, they weren't posting in English, stating that this is from cringe people who grew up to engage in moral harassment or power harassment. Someone stating that it's a shitty child song sung by a shitty child angry at adults. They associated the language use with people who have a communication disability. Otaku, right? Saying that otaku would like it, or that this language use is like an otaku trying to put on airs. Or the imagination of a shut-in, a hikikomori was the word that they used, who has never worked a day in their lives. So associated with people who just aren't real members of society. A lot of these groups, like otaku, people with communication disabilities, children, these are considered like not proper otona in this kind of discourse, right? Like a proper otona Nihonji would not use these kind of words. An unemployed person, right, gathered online. The lyrics that of Vocaloid performers. So this kind of language being associated with the Vocaloid scene, or not a Chunibyo, right, rejecting the prior discussions that we've seen, but just a worker who can't do their job. Now, this is although very interesting from the Japanese perspective, but I also want to see just from the other perspective, what happens when Japanese people have to engage, like have to be vulgar because they're engaging with vulgar texts, right? And so I did a study recently that again, hopefully will come out this year. And that was a looking at the translation of English vulgarities into Japanese in the first season of the show The Boys and the first season of the show Russian Doll. And I chose these shows, one, because they're filled with vulgarity. So that, they had the data. But also The Boys primarily has male actors in the prominent roles, not entirely, but primarily, whereas Russian Doll instead has primary female characters doing the swearing. The proportion, there's more women swearing more often in Russian Doll than men. And I also chose them because these are mainstream shows, so they have actual money behind the translation process, and they are translating for kind of an international audience. So one thing, though, that was very, very clear very early on is that this study was going to be a bit tricky to do because there's been a lot of research over about the last decade, about a decade so far, looking at the translation of vulgarity, and most of it is between European languages. And the way that these studies work is that they look for the swear word in the original language, and then they find a lexical equivalent in the target language. So, if there's like English to French, they find a shit, they find a merde, which I butchered, I'm sure I don't speak French. And they're like, okay, look, there's an equivalent. We did it. That didn't work for me. Like I started this study just saying, okay, I'll copy the methodology of this European to European studies. And that wasn't going to, like that quickly became impossible because there's translations like this, right? Where you have a goddamn national treasure. And that is translated as, in the dub, ningen kokuho rebelu dazo. Now, if we remove the dazo, there's nothing of interest, right? You just have national, like people, national treasure level, and then dazo. So if we adopt the European approach to this study, we would say, okay, dazo is a translation of goddamn, right? Dazo is vulgar. But I found things like this. Like, this wasn't part of my proper data because there's no swearing, but do you want to talk about it is translated as hanashi kiku zo. I'll listen to what you have to say, zo. Or I'm deadly, naguru zo. There's no vulgarity being translated. So it appeared to me that characters that were vulgar were often given a speech style that kind of ran throughout everything that they said, that had a lot of the features that were part of kind of this vulgarity. And that made it tricky to say, okay, this is a translation or this is a non-translation, because one of the main findings of this work to date is that pretty much in every single case, not all, but most cases, the amount of vulgarity in original text is reduced in translation. But how can I say that when the features that I'm noting being used to translate appear in non-vulgar situations? None of the studies I analyzed found like vulgarity being added elsewhere, whereas I potentially am. And how do I even say that this stuff is vulgar? Like, if hanashi kikuzo is being used to mean, do you want to talk about it? Can I say it's vulgar when it's used to being translated, used to translate a goddamn national treasure? This was like a problem with the fundamental idea for the study. So what I did is I divided swearing into 4 types. And this was based off prior research. So there were emphasizers, like it's fucking great. This is stuff that you could delete and still have a grammatical sentence. Like, it's great is grammatical. The second is interjections, so like, oh shit, fuck, damn, right? Things like that. And then abusive terms directed at humans, like you asshole, or abusive terms for items or actions, like look at this shit, I fucked him. These are cases where we can't delete the word, like I, him, or you. Look at this, it doesn't work, but we can replace them with a less vulgar option, right? Like you guy, or look at this thing, right? That's possible. Most studies of European language translation have combined these categories, but I found quite early on that for type 3 and type 4, there were different translation strategies. Like type 3 involved a lot of pronouns, so I thought it would be important for my data. But then the bigger change is that for each vulgarity I found in English, I coded everything as translation. So all irregular conjugations, all pronouns besides first person pronouns, excepting a case where a character switched to a new one, all sentence final particles, and all items that I've seen in prior studies of Japanese media, I coded as translation. So what this means in practice is that if we had something like, you ate the goddamn apple, if that came as ringo tabeta, which is like ate apple, right? No pronoun, nothing. I would consider this omission. So this is a much stricter version of omission than prior studies, right? Prior studies would not would consider this omission, but they would not consider things like this omission. In my study, if someone said "anata ga ringo o tabeta," which obviously I don't think anyone here would call that vulgar Japanese, but I consider that non-omission because I wanted to remove my preconceptions of what is vulgar from the data as much as possible so that I could be most accurate in my analysis. Likewise, ringo o tabeta ne has ne in it, which is a sentence final particle, so I can't say objectively that that's not a translation of like goddamn. I included this as non-omission, right? Ringo tabeta ka. So that has that ka form that we saw in the Biden translation in Usseewa. That would also be considered non-omission. And then something like teme ga ringo o tabeyagatte, which involves forms that, again, are definitely non-polite, and other Japanese academics have said are non-polite, that would still be non-omission. So going forward, when I show these next tables, when I say that something is omission, I mean that it looks like ringo o tabeta. Like there's no pronoun, there's nothing of interest. It is a non-omission statement is a statement where we could show it to a Japanese person and say, who said this? And they just shrug because there's like no contextual information besides that it's in the plain form, which in my data is not interesting because almost everything's in plain form. So with that said, here is the translations of English vulgarity in the boys. And as you can see, I've divided between the dub and the subs. And I'll give you a second to look at this because this table is kind of complicated. But as you can see, in pretty much every single case, women have more cases of omission. So this is not non-omission, this is omission, right? Women have more omission in almost every single category than men, regardless of sub or dub. So women are getting less vulgarity, and they're getting less anything, right? It's just being dropped in the translation. Additionally, and I think kind of interestingly, the dub actually has less omission than the subtitles. And I have no idea why that is. In the paper, I theorize it's because in the subbing, you can hear them say fuck, shit, damn, whatever in English. So, like Japanese people usually are familiar with those words to some extent. So perhaps the translator is thinking, oh, look, they'll just know it's vulgar because they can hear the English. I'm not sure. But the dub actually was more, I guess, I'm not sure if the right term, aggressive in translating the vulgarity. But you can see a gender difference here. And you can also see, though, that omission is quite common. At like the lowest, it's about 12.3%. Here is the only case where we see women being translated more than men, but it's only 2 out of 14 versus 17 out of 73. This isn't like, statistically significant. Here's a colored version, which I think hopefully is a bit easier to see. Again, you can basically see that the women's bars tend to go farther to the right than the men's bars for the same color, which means that there's more omission in that category, right? So we're seeing here that not only is omission happening, which is not interesting on a global scale, but additionally, the gender of the speaker is influencing how the translators are approaching the translation and if they're willing to do anything at all in terms of translating the vulgarity. Now, in Russian doll, we see a bit of a different change here in that women are, in some cases, being given less omission. Like here, we're seeing 6% versus 42%. So it's only 7 terms, but almost half of the men's abusive terms, like this asshole or something like that, were not translated in any way of interest at all, like not even given a pronoun. But we can still see that in most cases, despite that women swear way more in this show than the men do, they are still having more omission in terms of how they are translated. Although again, we actually see that the dubs do a better job of translating than the subs do. And here's the color version. So again, just you can compare how far the lines are over. The farther over a line is, the more omission that is happening. So what's important though is that since for me non-omission means anything, there's also the question of the quality of the translation. Like we can say that men are having their vulgarity translated more than women, that's fine. But is there also a difference in terms of what being translated means? And the answer is yes. So to sum up what I'll go through, not only are women having more of their vulgarity omitted, when their vulgarity is translated into something, the forms used tend to not be forms that are traditionally called vulgar and tend to be quite different from the forms normally being used by men. So for instance, kuso is a pretty straightforward Japanese swear word because it translates pretty similarly to shit. Indeed, it can be used in a way that we don't use shit in English, like, kuso is an emphasizer for an adjective, kuso atsui. We don't say like shit, shitty hot. It's like shitty hot out. We say you're fucking hot. It has that kind of overlap. So kuso is used 40 times in men's dub speech and 25 times in their subtitled speech, representing 8.5 or 5.1% of all translation strategies in the boys. In women's, though, it's used 8%, 8 times and 4 times. And actually, if you look at the percentage, though, because women swear so much less, there's fewer female characters in the show, it's actually almost the same. So the use of kuso between men's speech and women's speech in the boys, the use of it as a translation strategy, is almost equal, right? It's within 0.5% each time. This trend will not maintain. But when we move to Russian doll, we can see that despite that men swear less in this show, it's 14.1 versus 4.7% of the translation strategies, whereas women use kuso more times in total, 19 versus 12, but it's about 5% less of all translation strategies. Like it's never used in the dub. So we are seeing percentage-wise a reluctance to use kuso in the Japanese translations of women's vulgarity in this show. Likewise, contemptuous pronouns. In Russian doll, across all translations, men use omai 4 times and anta 5 times. Women don't use omai once, but they use anta 12 times. So anta being associated more with women's speech, and the idea that women use omai is actually being not present in the data at all. Like the show does not let a woman call anyone else omai. In the boys, men use omai 71 times, anta 8 times, and teme twice. Teme generally considered much more offensive than the other two. But women use anta only 3 times and actually use anata 23 times, whereas men only use it 3 times. So when women are calling people assholes, bastards, bitches, etc., that's getting translated as anata, which is not usually considered vulgar, and indeed in context, I would say it's not vulgar at all. And sometimes even when they're swearing, their translation gets turned into polite speech, as we'll see. So while all these pronouns are in my data coded as non-emission, right? Any single pronoun I coded as non-emission, there's clearly a gap in what non-emission means between the two groups. Women are swearing less, and the words they're getting as a translation are, at least from a generalist perspective, considered less offensive. Another interesting example comes from the use of the word ass. The use of ass to literally refer to the human butt only appears in the boys. And it's translated in men's speech via the vulgar ketsu 5 times across subtitles and dubbing combined, with the lighter oshiri used only once. In contrast, women's use of the literal ass in the boys is translated 6 times as oshiri with no uses of ketsu whatsoever. So like the boys does not let, despite that in English, both men and women are using ass to refer to a butt, women are not allowed to use the word ketsu in any of the translations at all. So interestingly, there's even cases where ketsu is used for male translations of the word butt. So this scene here, for instance, didn't make my formal data because the guy says played my butt like jazz, and butt is not considered a vulgarity usually, but it's translated as boku no ketsu, not boku no oshiri, right? In contrast, one of the data from the women is a female person in the show who is stating the phrase, say you're a dirty pig who likes to eat ass, and that is translated as oshiri. So even in this extremely vulgar sexual situation, the show does not let her use ketsu. And in some cases, all reference to an ass gets deleted. In this scene here, a character says that they have, quote, an ass you could bounce a quarter off of. So they're making an emphasis of their own, basically, sexual attractiveness via a semi-vulgar term. And both the dubbing and the subtitling remove any emphasis to an ass or even to like sexual attractiveness at all, stating that they're just young and bright-eyed. So the vulgarity is gone, basically. Any translation whatsoever disappears. Indeed, this kind of thing happens time and time again when we look at the use of women swearing in this show. In this scene, you have 2 characters. One, the woman on the left says, say you fucking understand to the man on the right. Now, the man on the right is a prolific swearer in the show, and this actually represents a kind of rare moment of acquiescence. In this situation, the woman has kind of power. She is telling him that he needs to say he understands, and he actually does say that, and he says it in a non-vulgar way. He actually like acquiesces to her more vulgar and aggressive command. In contrast, in the Japanese, this is translated in the women's speech using watashi as the first person pronoun, and then just shite, right? Not shite kudasai, not shinas, not like, shiro, just shite. In contrast, the man uses the shite yaru form with the same verb, which is again, not a polite way of saying things. Like, I will do it. This is how you say you're going to like give food to a dog or like, give water to a plant. You don't say te yaru to somebody who is above you in social status. But because, again, you have this gender ideology in Japanese that women shouldn't use vulgar forms and that men speak roughly, his vulgarity, his general vulgarity is overriding the actual power balance in this scene, with her speaking more politely and him speaking in a more aggressive, potentially offensive manner. And indeed, this kind of like norms of Japan overriding translation is also seen in Russian Doll in this scene here, where the main character goes to a expensive jewelry store, and the jewelry clerk says, come on, you're fucking with me. People really like to fuck with me. And obviously this is meant to be humorous, right? Like we don't expect in an American context either for a worker at a store like this to use the F word. But in Japanese, the workers' dialogue, be it because they're a woman, be it because they are working in this kind of store, is not given any vulgarity whatsoever. It's translated as jodan desu ne, like that's a joke, isn't it? Yamete kudasai, please stop. So the swearing here is completely erased so that the dialogue matches the Japanese norms, I suppose, for a upper class, an expensive kind of jewelry store, rather than the actual vulgarity of the character in this context. Similarly, the meireke is used, like we saw it, in Usseewa, we saw it in Biden's translation, is used for 110 vulgarities in the boys, so that's 11.13%, but just 4 times in the speech of women. In contrast, Women's swearing includes the use of te kudasai and te choudai, which are never used to translate swearing by men in this show. In both series, forms ending in A, so like hide, we talked about that, of course, with Usseewa, right? Only appear in translations of male vulgarity. Women are not allowed in these translations to use these forms. And pronoun switches are rare, but they only happen in men's speech. There's a male character that uses boku. We saw him earlier, the one saying boku no ketsu. Sometimes when he swears a lot, he'll switch to ore. But you never see a woman, no matter how much they swear, switch to a different pronoun. It's just not doesn't happen whatsoever. And we also then have sentence final issues. So here is the use of various sentence final forms. Again, I coded everything, right? So these were all treated as non-omission. These were all treated as a translation of vulgarity. And as you can see in the boys, they don't even let women use da. If you're taking like Japanese 1010, you learn da as like just the plain form of des, right? And if you write Japanese in the essay style, the da de arutai, right? You're going to use da. But this may surprise people that don't have a background in Japanese because of this, but there's actually been like a lot of discourse about like women shouldn't end sentences in da. I've read at least like 3 or 4 studies that have analyzed like letters to the editor, people writing to newspapers, where people are complaining like, oh, I hear these women on the street and they're saying like da, and they shouldn't do that. And that's surprising. And it's almost something like, oh, I thought when I read that stuff, I was like, oh, okay, that's like an old thing. But we're seeing it manifested in my data, right? Only one woman in the entire show, The Boys, in the subtitling or the dubbing, ever gets to end a sentence in da if that sentence has swearing in the English translation. Likewise, while men and women can both use yo, we see women use ne a lot more. Remember that we have 7 and 5 versus 1 and 5, but that 7 and 5 represents less dialogue. And only men are being shown using zo and ze. In contrast, women are using no and wa, with the, of course, like noyo, wane, those kind of things being associated with sort of refined women's speech rather than vulgarity. Russian doll is a bit more flexible here. We're allowing the women to use da, right? Where it's 2026, women can use da now. And they're also using yo, but we've seen that ne is never used in men's speech when translating their swearing. In contrast, it does appear in women's. Women are allowed to use zo just twice, but it happens, but never ze. Ze is not used. And while wa is absent from anyone's speech, the use of no as a translation is appearing there as well. So throughout all this data, we're definitely seeing like, okay, here are some forms that are vulgar. Japanese definitely has swear words. There are these terms that are being used to translate swearing. We can identify them. I found them. They're matching things that we've seen before. The idea that Japanese doesn't have swearing is not on the table. But we are definitely seeing the idea that certain forms should not be used or are not be used, or even if they are being used in English, we can't use them in Japanese when they're being used by women. The speaker, the gender of the speaker is influencing the idea of what is vulgar. So saying that a term is vulgar out of context is becoming more and more difficult. And we're seeing reflections of social beliefs about vulgarity, which of course, vulgarity itself is social, right? Like if everyone that speaks English just disappears, shit isn't vulgar. Shit's not even a word anymore. It's just a conjunction of sounds. It's society that decides what's vulgar. And we're seeing these reflections of Japanese society, or at least images that certain people in Japanese society want to present of Japanese society regarding what is vulgar and how people should speak, to the extent that even, again, women in New York who do drugs and swear a lot are presented as, prolific swearers. Russian Doll is not a show about people in a boardroom. Even in that context, even with characters that are supposed to be vulgar and do things that are obviously not associated with traditional examples of femininity in America or Japan, are having this vulgarity kind of removed from their speech. And this brings me to my final study, which is on Allen-sama and Kurimango. Now, Kurimango is a very interesting style for me because basically it's a speech register which has been created by a person, and that's Allen-sama. Normally, people don't make speech registers. Like, who created Kaggle, right? Who created the polite form? Nobody. Who created NetSpeak? A bunch of people, but they weren't working together. Allen-sama has actually created their own variety of Japanese. And the name of it, of course, is itself vulgar, as it combines Japanese terms for 2 sexual organs and then the word for go, right? So it's inherently vulgar. And this is what it looks like. It's very hard to read. And it's very interesting, though, because it combines a lot of emoji. It combines a bunch of small characters. but it also combines vulgar forms with polite forms. The posts on the left there, which is if you've seen have millions of views and hundreds of thousands of likes, are both extremely graphic depictions of sexual encounters that Allen-sama is talking about. But on the other hand, on the right, we have uses of things like kudasaimase, or at the bottom there, you have gozaimasu centimeteru zamasu no. So again, this kind of play combining gozaimasu with these forms like the shortening of Japanese for a centimeter and then a meter and then zamasu. This mixture is very unique. A lot of the features here, we can say it draws on things like, garugo in the past, but it goes to a huge extent. Like this up here at the top, we have the gozaimasu kara Korea girl tachi. This is a form of language play because kara is in like because is homophonous with the name of a Korean pop band. So they start saying the girls from Korea, but it's supposed to just be read as kara. It just means because. But this sort of like extra effort is all part of the style. And the paper I'm working on is trying to understand this style. But in doing so, I stumbled across the importance of vulgarity to this style. Because we didn't just want to analyze I'm working on this, by the way, with a Japanese PhD student at UCLA. And both of us didn't just want to analyze what the style is, but also why do the fans of this style use it? Because Allen-sama is the person that created and proliferated this at the start, but the fans are the ones that really kind of keep it going. And so we did a survey of Kuriman, fans of Allen-sama, users of Kurimango. And as you can see right from the bat, our survey got 373 people, which was really nice. And 82% though identified as women. So this is a highly female fan base, which is something we need to keep in mind given what we've seen so far about basically all the translation we've been doing, right? Ado being critiqued for being a woman, the less women translation in the programs that we talked about. These are a lot of women are big fans of Allen-sama. And we asked a lot of questions. One of the fundamental ones, the first ones, was why do you think Kurimango is interesting? And as you can see, there's a lot of different hits. Like it's unique. It connects me to Allen-sama. It connects me to fans. Some people saying it's like learning another language. Some people saying it's natsukashi, like Garumoji were. But down at the bottom, there's an also. And in that also, it was an open-ended response. And one of the responses was, I like dirty words. So right off the bat, this is one of our first questions. We have people saying that the vulgarity of this style is interesting to them. This expanded, though, as we started asking them, like, why do you think fans of Allen-sama use Kurimango? And as you can see, the number one response is as part of Oshikatsu for Allen-sama, which makes sense, right? It's part of how they connect and how they do the support of Allen-sama as a talent. But the second one, at 60%, is things I can say things I normally can't say. So let's dive into this. Also, this came up in this as well. Like, has Kurimango has it affected your normal Japanese speech to some extent? And 71% of people said yes. So in looking at the answers here, a lot of people said that what they use about it is it lets them be filthy. It lets them be vulgar. I can easily talk about indecent topics. When customers at the evening store, terrible translation there, I'm not a translator, yoru no mise, some kind of bar or who knows, say words that hurt me, I can stab back with Kurimango. I can't normally use dirty words, but with Kurimango, I can say them as much as I want, and I can say things confidently. I tend to use words like stupid cock or dangerous dirty man to explain that dangerous oji, right? That's not like a normal word. That's a Kurimango thing. But as you can see, they've written old man using dirty, the kanji for dirty for the sound o. So it's like one of their internal insults. But these are creative insults that they made up as a group. It's part of Kurimango itself, but it lets them use these kind of terms that they consider to be vulgar. Then this other person noting that because Allen-sama uses polite terms, that actually lets them say vulgar things. So this is really interesting to me because like we have from as a native English speaker, I've always been kind of jealous of how many ways Japanese people have to say things, right? You have plain form, you have polite form, you have keigo, you have kenjogo, you have all these forms which let you like give off all these different vibes and express all these different identities. But the Japanese people here are saying, we want more, right? All the forms that are available aren't enough. I was not able to use these dirty words until I got this new speech style, which made it possible. And that actually lets us maybe like reflect back to the very beginning of this presentation, where it might not be that the Japanese people being interviewed don't know these terms, but they can't find a situation to use them. And indeed, remember, I saw that in my own data about the metal artists saying that like they're getting critique from using these terms in normal context. Well, this new register creates a new context where these words that they knew about but they could never feel comfortable using, they can now feel comfortable using them, right? It gives them access to it. And the person below says they use too much kurimango, and so they accidentally almost said a word that is ranchimpo, which is I've translated as lunchok, which is basically this is how they say lunch because they combine lunch with chimpo, and that's their kurimango word for lunch. So it just means lunch. Uh, you can figure out how I made the English translation if you want. But they almost said it out loud. So this is not a thing they can normally say, right? They don't feel they can say this at work normally for kind of obvious reasons. But now they have this new context, this new space, and so it's not like the vulgarity was new. Like chimpo itself does not come from Kurimango, but the ability to use it, a place to use it, and a community that would accept them using it and embracing them using it is new. So it's not that the vulgarity doesn't exist, it's that the social contexts where vulgarity are allowed are limited, especially again for women. 80% plus of our respondents were women in this context. And when we looked at people saying, like, have you gotten criticism for using Kurimango? Only 13% said yes, out of the 204 who answered this question. And that's not surprising because most people used Kurimango online. And if you're using Kurimango to other people who use Kurimango, they're not going to critique you, right? Like I'm in Australia. If I use swearing at like an Australian bar, no one's going to be like, "Excuse me, that's offensive." It's an Australian context. They're swearing. It's okay to swear in a bar. But even then, some people did no critique. And when we asked them to explain why they were critiqued, well, you had things like this. I was told I was vulgar. I was told it was unpleasant. These people saying like, yes, the terms are being labeled as vulgar, so they exist and people will critique them. But even more interesting, at least for me, is that some of the people used vulgarity in answering this question, stating the first there is that they weren't using Kurimango, but they said they were a fan of Allen-sama at Barata, right? I guess they got outed, and they were told it was gross, and they used the form kutabare NP. NP is Kurimango for normal person, and it is kind of an abusive term for anyone who doesn't understand Allen-sama, anyone who doesn't use Kurimango. Non-fans are called NP. And kutabare, of course, is like drop dead in the command form, not polite Japanese, right? Kutabare did appear quite often in the translations, for instance, of male vulgarity in The Boys, etc., when someone tells you, like to fuck off, etc. And here, a person says that they were, people complained about them about a Aran-sama ni rikai ga nai kuso otoko, right? So they're actually using vulgarity to kind of protect Allen-sama, to protect their oshikatsu, and to protect the fact that these terms have meaning for them, right? They found access to them through this style. Indeed, even a person who didn't swear noted that, when they are kind of saying abusive language to themselves or when they're excited, they use this. And they'll use it with their friends who can, quote, forgive their heart, or on Twitter. So this Kurimango is allowing them, giving them the confidence to use these forms, and because they feel like they've been blocked, like polite Japanese, plain Japanese, etc., haven't permitted these people, especially these women, to use the various vulgarity. Well, it's always been there, but now Kurimango gives them kind of the chance. So these studies were not meant to communicate with each other, but I've tried to kind of link them together. And the reason, like, what's the point of that, though? What can we learn from all this? Well, to wrap this up, and hopefully you'll all agree, I think I've showed, hopefully very clearly, that Japanese vulgarity exists. It's real. They have swear words. There are worse things than shimatta in Japanese that we can say. And these forms do regularly result in social backlash, they result in censorship, or they result in shock or used for shock, right? The level of vulgarity of a statement, though, is always contextual, no matter what language we're talking about. That's always true. Again, in the Australian context, calling someone a cunt can be a term of endearment, not at the university context, but among, for instance, tradies. It's quite common. It's been studied. There's research on it. But in Japanese, this contextuality is likely more important and definitely more complex than in English and I'd say most European contexts. As a result, it does become difficult to label something as inherently vulgar out of context. Like, is zo inherently vulgar? I would say no. I don't think my research shows that, but it definitely shows that it can be, with individual features deemed fine or vulgar across, different contexts. Speaker gender then is a major part of this context, And this is something that, again, is universal. In English, for instance, you might hear like, no one should swear. But if a woman swears too much, they'll say, oh, she's not acting ladylike. Whereas if a man swears, he'll say, oh, he's acting speaking like a sailor, right? Or just being vulgar. The idea that women swearing removes their womanness or something like that, where no one's like, oh, swearing, that's not manly. Be manly, don't swear. We don't hear that. So the gender is not Japanese specific, but this level of it where certain forms are just not even given to women in translation, even if it's very clear that the woman is supposed to be a quote vulgar woman who doesn't obey the norms or like the conservative ideologies about women's behavior. That does seem to be quite emphasized in the Japanese context. Um, and so we need to go beyond like just understanding swear words as swear words because that comes from a more English understanding. We definitely grammar forms, conjugations, etc. All these things can be vulgar. As a result, if we want to study this more, we need to study Japanese vulgarity, Asian vulgarity, etc., any kind of non-European vulgarity, really, not only just to understand these contexts, but also to understand vulgarity itself. Because approaches to data collection analysis that have been successful in Western contexts may need adjustment or might just not work. One of the reasons we might think places like Japan have no vulgarity is because we're applying methodologies and analytical strategies which were developed for English. And English does not represent, or German or French, whatever. These do not represent the entirety of language around the world. And when something doesn't fit within our framework, that's not an example of that thing. What's something that exists in another language that isn't in the original language, does not exist in the framework made for that language, that isn't evidence that the thing is therefore outside of whatever the framework is looking at. It's evidence that we need to reconsider our framework to consider whether or not that thing belongs inside of it, right? We need to have that readjustment. Secondly, we need to have a higher emphasis on reception and interpretation with as little a priori defining of vulgarity as possible. We obviously, starting from things like, okay, as a native speaker, I know that this word is vulgar, therefore I will look for uses of that word. That's not a bad place to do a study, especially early on. But we're kind of past that in every language. We have data saying that these words are generally considered vulgar, but we need to open our mind and just look at what exists and what people are talking about as vulgar so that we can find out what people are actually themselves saying is vulgar. Not academics, but just humans, right? We need to note that, okay, some of what they're talking about vulgarity is not even the words themselves, but just the people that use these words. Therefore, it's more about the person speaking than the words themselves. That kind of thing happens when we look at the discussions rather than starting from the top down. And so what's currently missing then from our data set, what we really, really need to expand on this, I'd say in every language, is in-depth interviews with people who are willing and able to discuss their views. I hope what I showed earlier is that in looking at the forum comments where people were talking about Usseewa online, that when Japanese people aren't talking to an academic, they're very able, when they're just chatting with themselves on an online forum, they're very able to label terms as vulgar. They're very able to show that Japanese has more than one swear word. They're very able to discuss these terms. But in all the studies we have, they clam up. And that's probably because, as you all know, the number one population we interview in academic research is students, right? People at university. And also there's power differences. We need research that, if possible, goes online and finds this discourse, but that's always tricky because you have to find the discourse and it just might not exist online or it might be too hard to uncover. But we need to sit down with people that are like, oh yeah, I'm a Japanese person who swears all the time. Let me tell you about it. And that doesn't happen. We have no data on that. And I don't know who the population is. I don't know if there's ethics issues to access them. Like I think that I'm sure that Yakuza swear quite a bit, but I'm not sure anyone wants to do a study with them. That might be incredibly tricky and dangerous. But we need to, if we're going to say that Japanese doesn't have swearing, we can't do that if we haven't accessed these kind of populations. If we keep interviewing grad students, if we keep interviewing businessmen, if we keep interviewing 60-year-olds who are trying to present themselves as proper adult members of society, we're going to keep getting people telling us that they don't swear or that there's no swearing. And then finally, there needs to be greater attention to media and individuals which do not match the general norms of standard Japanese. People like Allen-sama or people that preceded Allen-sama, like Matsuko Deluxe, these kind of characters, they're not representative of the entire Japanese population, right? They're not, what's the word? Demographically significant in that sense. But the people that are willing to deviate from the norm, the people that are willing to deviate from the standard oftentimes are doing very, very interesting things. And by attending to what they do, by attending to these non-standard characters, be they characters in media who are presented as non-standard, non-normal, we can find access to things that are avoided in quote unquote normal characters, avoided in like the mainstream news, et cetera, mainstream media, because that's supposed to match a standard. Whereas deviation welcomes the access of these and the use of these forms. Kurimango obviously involves a lot of forms that are unique and new, that have not been used elsewhere. But they're also very clearly borrowing things that existed before, but that you're not supposed to use and repurposing them in that way. And so if we focus our research on any language, but especially in Japanese, only on the standard, only on the norm, only on polite speech, only on how people are supposed to talk, we're obviously not going to get access to how people are not supposed to talk, despite that, arguably, in the history of any country, people who talk in the way that they're not supposed to is far more the majority than people who talk in the way that they're supposed to. So there you go. Thank you for listening to my presentation and my study. I hope it was interesting. And yeah, I look forward to your questions. Appreciate you having me here.